And I would like to introduce the first speaker from abroad, from the UK. She's also very much involved in the reform project. She's Angela Gurnell, one of the work package leaders also. Angela is studied geography in Exeter, and she's now working in the Queen Mary University of London. She's involved in many projects concerning hydrological processes, geomorphological research groups. She's also a member of a British Hydrological Society. Anyhow, she's very broad involved in all these aspects of river restoration. And I would like to give you, Angela, the floor and tell us more about the... sorry? Tell us more about the vegetation and morphology. Yes? Okay. You know, this is your... You know how this works? This is forward.
That's the slides, is it? Forward?
Forward, backwards, and there's the pointer, the green one. Yes?
Oh, I see. Okay.
Yeah, okay.
Try this out. There we are. So thank you, Tom, for the introduction to reform. I'm work package leader for work package 2, which is developing a hierarchical approach to the assessment of hydromorphology. I was actually asked to talk about vegetation and hydromorphology, so what I decided to do was to break the talk down into 3 sections. To first of all introduce this hierarchical approach, but I think you'll hear more about it from Massimo later on, Massimo Rinaldi. So just a very brief introduction, and then I'll move straight into the role of vegetation, how do plants operate in fluvial systems, which is a small part of this framework, and then give you an example of a restoration scheme which illustrates, I hope, some of the points that I'm making. So, in talking about the hierarchical framework, again, because the topic is vegetation and hydromorphology, I am deliberately weaving vegetation into this, although within the actual framework it will be a smaller part. But in terms of the framework, what we're trying to do is to move from just a very reach-based approach to assessing hydromorphology to trying to look more broadly at the setting of the reach within its catchment. And driving that is the idea that if we have what I would call a naturally functioning reach, which doesn't mean to say humans have been there, haven't been there, but the fact that the processes are functioning fairly naturally, what we should see is that our fluvial processes, water, sediment movements and so on, are actually interacting with vegetation within and along the margins of the channel. So that's the first principle. And therefore, whenever possible, whenever you've got the space and the opportunity, it's really good to try and explicitly build these interactions into restoration. And because the plants and the processes, the physical processes, are not just a function of the reach, but they're coming from the broader catchment, we need to take account of what's going on in the catchment as well as in the reach in order to build these things in an appropriate way. And therefore, we might expect different styles of restoration to be the most sustainable approaches in different reaches and also in different catchment settings. Okay, so what our hierarchical approach does, and what you'll find is it's basically a way of thinking that you'll have all this or much of this information already, but it's a way of arranging it so that you get a better understanding of how your reach is functioning. We take up the catchment and we divide it up into spatial units. I'll explain what these are in a minute. We then try and characterise the condition of those spatial units now, what's there, what's happening, and then try and look at any information we've got on what's gone on in the past. From those characterisations, we then extract a series of indicators, and those indicators help us to interpret past changes current condition and therefore what might happen in the future, whether you leave the reach alone or you go in and you modify it in some way. And this is clearly a framework within which you then go in and do your hydraulic modelling and the more detailed sort of quantification of what's going on. So the spatial units really start with the region, the biogeographical region you're in within Europe. You then have a look at your catchment. You break the catchment up into landscape units, so areas like mountains, hills, plains, these sort of broad landscape types. And within those landscapes, you then start to look at pieces of the river network, which we've called segments, so fairly long sections of the river network within these landscape units. And of course the segments we can break down into reaches, and we can do it on the basis of two things. The fact that those reaches are actually looking different and functioning differently at the moment, but also you might define a reach because you want to do a specific type of management on it. And basically the character of that reach and how it might support the ecosystem relates to the hydraulics, both within the channel and during floods, and the morphological units that those hydraulics induce. So what we're thinking about is trying to characterise, if you like, the cascade of processes that goes on in catchments. At the regional scale, we've got a given climate. We've also, because I'm explicitly weaving vegetation in here, we've got species, and clearly they vary across Europe. Within our catchment and its landscape units, we're seeing how that climate is translated into runoff production, into sediment production, and of its vegetation into seed production. When we get to the river network and segments of the river network, clearly the runoff, the sediment and the seeds are moving through the river system, and so we see a particular flow regime, a particular sediment transport regime, and hopefully some dispersal of plants, until we get to our reach level when we can see those plants, sediments and flows actually interacting with one another. And that creates the set of habitats or landforms that we've got within that reach. But of course, because we're in Europe, and particularly in Northern Europe, and particularly in the Netherlands and southern UK, we've got enormously heavy human pressures also influencing these processes. And again, the type of human pressure varies depending upon the spatial scale you're looking at. From non-native species at a regional scale, through the way we manage the land, we drain the land, through to major structures on the river network, such as dams, other flow regulation structures, sediment mining, whatever goes on. And then by the time we get to the reach scale, we're then looking at direct modifications like channelization, embanking and reinforcement. And that cascade in turn affects this landform and habitat dynamics. So it's starting to understand why it is we've got what we see there now and how we might help to manipulate that to a more healthy functioning system. Okay, so that's the framework. We end up with a series of indicators, time indicators and space indicators at these different spatial scales. We're in the middle of doing this at the moment. So what I'm just trying to do in the next 2 or 3 slides is illustrate how you might use that information, those indicators. The idea is you use the indicators to understand the past and present and think about the future in terms of either leaving the river alone or manipulating it in some way. So I've got a really nice example here from the US where, of course, you can go back to the beginning of at least European influence, but where somebody has done this, trying to understand the pressures at different spatial scales and how they've affected this particular river system, which is now heavily degraded. It's a Californian system. So we can look at the pressures in their catchment context. We can also look at our understanding of processes in the catchment context by looking at things like information on past river dynamics, for example, or long-term flow records or whatever. And we can start to link those two together. And again, this is the US example on the right, linking pressures at different spatial scales through time, and also how those might have affected processes. So that's just a very brief introduction to the broad approach. I now want to move from that and understanding how that knowledge might help us to specifically look at vegetation. I could talk about all sorts of different things to do with vegetation, but I think maybe the most useful thing to talk about is the particular plant species that we have which can help us to engineer our river systems, these ecosystem engineering plants. In other words, can we use natural processes and can we use plants and just, if you like, help to push them in the right direction to create more well-functioning systems. So when I talk about ecosystem engineering plants, I'm talking about plants that really thrive in disturbed river environments and that they actually control as well as respond to what's going on around them. And because they partially control what's going on, they actually influence the morphology and the structure and the function of both the river channel and the margins. And so they can actually help us to restore river edges. What plants am I looking at? I apologise to any high-level ecological scientists here. This is a sort of rather simplistic view, but I hope it'll be interesting. Often we're talking about riparian trees. They're the really powerful ecosystem engineers. But as you look at lower energy river systems, so the aquatic plants become very important, and certainly in the lowland England, it's emergent aquatic plants which can really affect our river form and dynamics. And if we go to even lower energy systems, and probably many you're looking at the smaller systems in the Netherlands, it's actually the submerged aquatic plants are important, and in fact they are probably the sole cause of any morphological complexity you've got. So we're looking at these different plant groups, and it's different species within these different groups in different river systems, depending upon the physical constraints that they're subject to. So a plant can only engineer a river if it's within that fairly broad niche in which it can actually deal with the physical processes, the flow energy, the moisture availability, the calibre of the bed material, and so on. So to give you an example of this, if we look at aquatic macrophytes, we've got about 700 sites here, reaches across Great Britain, Scotland, Wales and England, where we have information on processes and we also have information on aquatic plants. So the plants are grouped here into morphological types depending upon how rigid and how big they are and the degree to which they stick up through the water column. And by doing this basically principal components analysis of the key physical properties that might be affecting these plants, although there's an enormous noise in the data, nevertheless there's quite a clear gradient in my eyes across this plot, where once you get to the right-hand side and you've got rivers of high stream energy, very coarse substrate, macrophytes become irrelevant. You've just got a few mosses in there. But as you reduce the energy and therefore get finer and finer substrates, so these plants come into their own. And particularly when we get to the left-hand oval there, where we've got these emergent plants and the more robust submerged plants, we're in an environment there where the stream power is low, the sediments on the bed are quite fine, and if you take the plants out, these fine sediments will just spread right across the riverbed and you'll have no morphological complexity whatsoever. But with the plants, they can start to interact and we start to get a more complex system. So we've got these physical constraints, certain rivers affected by certain plants. We've also clearly got biological constraints. We're only going to have the species if they exist within the catchment species pool. We're only going to be able to use them in terms of a sort of self-sustaining system if those species can actually move freely through the river network. And then, of course, there are other biological factors like competition, which are actually less important in this case because what we're looking at is the plants, those first colonising plants along these rivers and their margins. So what I'm talking about is plants engineering on the edge. So if we look at the various types of plant we might be talking about, on the left we've got the physical processes which are constraining where they can do this. And on the right we've got the two key properties of these engineering plants. One is a reasonably sizable canopy that can trap sediments. And the second is a robust set of below-ground organs of some sort which can anchor the plants into the substrate and also which can grow up through the new sediment that's being deposited, hang on to it and start to build habitats or landforms that can then be colonised by other more sensitive plants. So these are the sort of the little key components that allow plant colonisation. I've also had the flu, so I'm coughing away nicely here, sorry. And if we again simplistically think about our rivers in terms of, in Northern Europe, moist floodplains, and you go across your floodplain and then you go into a channel and you get to the middle of the channel on the right there, clearly your fluvial disturbances increase in that direction, and in the opposite direction plants become a more dominant component of the landscape structure that we see. And somewhere in the middle there's a hot spot or a hot band of engineering plants doing their thing. And if you see a patchy environment along the margin between bare sediments and complete plant cover, you're in the hot spot, and there's at least one plant species doing its stuff there. And if we go along the range of river types we've got in Europe, from very high energy to very low energy, it's quite apparent where these hotspots are. So on the left we've got a bar-braided system, major, about a kilometre wide. Trees are doing the engineering here, and we can see little green dots all the way along the edge of that braid plane, which are individual trees sprouting and creating landforms. Drop the energy a little bit, increase the fine sediment supply, and you start getting islands appearing. And we've got the dots around the islands. Drop the energy a little bit further, narrow the river, and the dots start to join up into lines, and we've got these what we call scroll bars on the upper edge of the basic point bar form there, and again plants engineering on the edge. If we drop the energy a little bit more, those lines fatten up a bit, spread across the bar surface, and eventually they disappear, and we've got trees right up to the channel edge. At that point, the energy's dropped enough that the macrophytes can start coming in, and I think you will see many rivers in the Netherlands look just like that one on the right, which is in southern England, where the patch is now along the edge of the water-filled channel, and we've got emergent macrophytes appearing. You've probably got some that look like the one on the left here as well, where we've got actually macrophytes right across the channel, but in big stands with flow between them. And actually the ultimate effect of that, but we've removed most of rivers of this type, will be some sort of anastomosing system like we've got on the right, that the macrophytes cause channel shifting, they cause avulsions, and you get lots of little channels, macrophytes in the channel, trees on the areas between the channels, and plants completely dominating that pattern there. Wouldn't be there without the plants. Okay, so that's the way plants might operate on the edge, and on those edges they construct landforms which add hydromorphological complexity to our rivers. On the high energy systems, it's trees, and because our riparian trees in Europe are largely able to sprout once they've been uprooted and dumped somewhere, you start to get these types of features which we call pioneer islands. So they're trees that have been uprooted, dumped, they start to shoot, they start to send down roots, they cause hydraulic complexity, and if they're dumped in close enough spacing, they join up and you get larger islands. And we can see them here. We've a meandering river at the top there, and you can see a line of them starting to join up and make a scroll bar, and at the bottom we can see them all around these central islands, with the potential to make the islands grow bigger, or if they're washed out, get smaller. And these trees have a phenomenal effect. You can all see 3 views of gravel bars here with of the order of 3 metres of silt sitting on top of them. And those 3 metres of silt are held there by tree roots. You can see in the top left individual layers from individual floods with roots sticking out of every layer. At the bottom we can see on the left where there's been an avulsion. The river's cut a new channel, dumped a load of gravel on its bed, but underneath there's this reinforced layer with roots still there. And on the right you can see the extension of the tree trunks down through this silt as the tree's grown up, as the sediments are graded and kept sending out adventitious roots. So absolutely massive effect on these rivers. If you go to slightly quieter environments, or you have at least 1 year without a major flood, then tree seedlings become very important. And here we can see very dense accumulations of tree seedlings along the edges of these side channels, growing very rapidly. And if you can see it, there's a scale on that top right diagram of 0.5 metre. So we've got about a metre's levee here of fine sediment held together by seedlings. And this is the way that riverbanks develop. It's just that we don't often have the opportunity to see it. Here's a contrast. Same site, 2005 after a massive flood, trees dumped high up. Down at the bottom there, 2 to 3 years later, we've had floods but no bank full floods, and as a result the trees on the top have grown and they started to join up and the islands have got bigger. And lower down, both in the background and the foreground, we can see these levee-type structures around the smaller channels. So plants are just amazing. It's just we don't often allow them to do these things. And once we get into the river, the macrophytes are doing exactly the same thing. So we get macrophyte colonization, emergent macrophyte colonization, fine sediments trapped, it degrades to the water surface, then the macrophytes die out because they want to be under the water, but we have a seed bank in that sediment, and so we get new species growing on and we get channel change. And this you're probably familiar with in the Netherlands. It's the most commonly occurring emergent macrophyte in the UK, Sparganium erectum, yanked out of the riverbed in the middle of the summer, and you can see it's got loads of roots and it's also got loads and loads of these very thick rhizomes. And if you start doing stupid things like excavating cores out of the riverbed and cutting them up and seeing how much biomass there's in them, along the top there you can see the total biomass in 5 centimetre deep layers at different months of the year. And on the right hand side we've got January, November and January. If we split it into roots and rhizomes, what you see on the right is by January there aren't any roots, they've all rotted. But we've got 15 centimetres deep web of rhizomes in this silty sediment holding it together and allowing the plant to shoot out next year and keep building upwards. And here's one plant restoring a river. So this is in the UK. This river has been widened, it's been deepened, and then they stopped cutting back the macrophytes. And you can see that the Sparganium is trapping fine sediment and producing a fine sediment point bar deposit on the left there. It's narrowing the channel and producing a lateral bar on the right, and it's basically putting the river back to about the dimensions that it would naturally be. On a less recently managed section, we can see this enormous migration of the river bank. These rivers, you know, the opinion in the UK is you've got to put bends into them, but you don't need to. The plants will do it for you. It's doing it here. It's undercutting on the right, the side there. This feature's moving out from the left, and it's all due to that plant. OK, so we've got all these little landforms created in different rivers by plants. If we look at a range of river types across the top there, and we look from the river bed at the bottom to the low flow water edge of the floodplain here, we can colour in this diagram with permanent vegetation, bare sediment, and then the ovals are the sorts of landforms we might see there as the vegetation encroaches in this patchy way during lower energy periods. OK, so finally, how does this relate to restoration? Yes. That's okay, I'll be there, honest. This was a bit of fun that the Environment Agency had some years ago. A river near Birmingham, which is our second city, where a gravel company wanted to extract gravel from the floodplain. So they were persuaded to do some river restoration alongside the gravel extraction. And the trial was, you can see at the top, there was a straight river previously, was to basically, once they'd taken the gravel, put a wiggly river back with whopping great embankments on either side of it, so it couldn't do any damage. But the gap between the embankments was about twice the width of the previous channel, and to just leave it and see what happens. And you can see that within the first year we've got massive bar forms there, and if you look closely you can see the plants in strips already growing on those bars within the first year. And 5 to 6 years in, we've got a wonderfully complex little corridor there, quite constrained, but with all sorts of geomorphological features and plant features. So on the basis of that, the next section upstream, we decided to add a bit of science to this and to actually look at the catchment and look at the opportunities and try and do something which would be more repeatable. So restoration, again, funded by gravel extraction. I say you need to look at the past. We looked at the past, and the river had been relocated at least 150 years ago to the side of its floodplain. There were no maps that told us where it used to be. So we went out and we wandered around and looked for evidence of where the river might have been in the past, pegged out the centre line of where we thought it was, and then the gravel extraction proceeded. Now, we were reasonably confident that if we just let it get on with it, we'd be okay. We've got a flashy flow regime because the catchment is 95% suburban. It's got houses all over it. But there were no significant flow or sediment blocking structures in the network, and the actual gravel in this channel was actually reasonably loose. It seemed to be moving. So that was sort of quite gave us confidence to go ahead. We had a couple of problems. One was Himalayan balsam. This is Impatiens glandulifera, completely infesting the next reach upstream, I mean everywhere. And also an adjacent industrial estate, which we didn't want to flood. So we found this historical channel centre line. There was some modelling done by proper hydraulic engineers to calculate the dimensions of the channel we needed to cope with something like a median annual flood. They went ahead, they just extracted the gravel from everywhere apart from a sinuous strip around this centre line and twice the width we needed to cut a new channel. At the end of the gravel extraction, they backfilled the floodplain with shale, put a bit of topsoil on, and then cut a completely uniform trapezoidal channel, that shape, down the middle of this intact floodplain. One low set, very well set back embankment to protect the industrial estate, shoved the water into the river, and that was it. No planting, no reinforcement, no topsoil, no nothing. Here's a plan of the site. The white lines are the edge of the floodplain. The industrial site is on a low terrace. I don't know whether it's artificial or natural. And you can see the old channel running along the left-hand side in its deepened channel by the industrial estate. And you can see the red area, which is where the river was diverted. 6 months in, one flood later, and we've already got vegetation on the banks, particularly on the inside of bends. And a lot of it was initiated by bank erosion upstream, and literally pieces of earth with plants on them floating down and rooting into the bank face, particularly wetland species. 2.5 years in, and we've got vegetation everywhere, and we've got macrophytes, emergent macrophytes, engineering the channel, building benches out at the bank toe. By 4 years in, we've now got a load of trees. These trees were bits of twig that were buried in the sediments around the macrophytes. They're now starting growing up, and you can see that there was a bit of tree planting by the Environment Agency on the top of the bank at some point. Exactly the same species have been planted by the river, but in the right place, which is the bottom of the bank. So the people-planted trees are now half dead and the other half are looking extremely sick. The one down the bottom are 4 metres high and doing very nicely, thank you. So 4 years in, we've got 150 native species, including young oak trees. We've got willow trees really starting to engineer the banks as well as the macrophytes. We've got pool riffle sequences, we've got bars, and we've got no Himalayan balsam, but I won't explain that. You can come and ask me later. 6 years in, and we've got a river which is absolutely impossible, in my view, to see it was ever restored. We've got point bars, point benches, bank extensions, side bars, scour pools, deep pools, riffles, you name it, we've got it. Large wood, all out of an urban catchment, still no Himalayan balsam. And at the end of the day, what we felt was a very successful restoration. And certainly on these small rivers, to me, demonstrates that the plants are really good at sorting things out for themselves. And I now stop.